Hi guys, it's Debbie, and let me answer right away the question I've been getting in my messages. Did I like the Odyssey? Yes. Is it a perfect movie? No, but no film is, and we'll get to everything bit by bit, including the negatives. And grab a coffee or tea or a snack or something, because it's probably going to be a long one. Actually, you know what was long? The 3 hours of the Odyssey, but they absolutely flew by. Now, first of all, I'm going to try to keep the big spoilers for the end of the video, but what we covered before really depends on what you consider a spoiler, what your threshold for spoilers is, because we will be covering a lot before that, so you've been warned. Second of all, I'm going to try my absolute best with the names, because for all my life, since we've studied this topic in school here in Italy, I've always ever read and said these names in Italian. So for me, everybody here is Ulisse, Menelao, Telemaco, la Maga Circe, Itaca, Cavallo di Troia. So I actually had to go and practice how to say the names in English, starting with Odysseus, the protagonist, this warrior who, after decades of war and fierce battles, is trying to return home to Ithaca with what remains of his men, with every storm, monster, enemy and obstacle imaginable thrown in their way. In pure Nolan fashion, the story is told in a non-linear manner, with Odysseus' journey shown through flashbacks, through the narrations of other characters, while in the present his lonely wife Penelope and his son Telemachus are waiting for him back home, still hopeful but increasingly fearful that he'll never actually make it home, while various suitors are trying to take over the throne. In between the images of Odysseus' journey, we also learn about all the alliances, enemies, spies, power struggles, betrayal, tough choices and class dynamics, all under the looming fear of the gods, who these characters genuinely believe have a direct effect on their lives. There are various laws in place. One we often hear in the film is the law of hospitality, which, if broken, can have nasty consequences. Often the dangers Odysseus and his crew face aren't only due to the people they meet and fight along their journey, but due to the consequences of defying the gods. Christopher Nolan was originally supposed to direct Troy a solid 20 years ago, but in the end the project went to Wolfgang Peterson, while Nolan was assigned the Dark Knight trilogy. So I guess it was a win-win situation for everybody, and I can imagine he couldn't wait to get his hands on a project like this, although he has admitted that back at the time he wasn't mature enough for this kind of scale of work, and now he has had a lot of experience with big scale productions. And this isn't just a big scale production, this is epic proportions production. And in a time where we're all completely brain rotting away with shrinking attention spans, where people are interested in whatever boring slop is shoved in front of them, and where the pursuit of art and beauty often gets pushed aside, it was wonderful to see cinemas packed for an adaptation of a poem written 3,000 years ago. A few days ago, I was sitting in an ice cream parlor and I could overhear the people at the table next to us, mind you, TikTok age kids, talking about Menelaus and Agamemnon and all of this story. And you can love or hate Nolan, but who else is doing this at the moment? Maybe didn't even nerve with Dune. This is Lord of the Rings level, and speaking of Lord of the Rings, which is one of my favourite sagas, adapting a world with this much lore into movie obviously requires a massive production, even after cutting out huge amounts of the original material. We're talking enormous budgets, locations, equipment, cast, crew. But the one thing that sets these kinds of works apart from any just generic big budget production is the sheer amount of effort put into achieving the quality of the film. Let's start with effects. We've got to the point in which we just are CGIing and AIing in everything. Things need to be pumped out quickly, quality gets pushed into second place, and in comes the CGI. Now, CGI isn't always bad. I mean, the famous Parasite house was literally CGI. Interstellar is stunning, and they obviously didn't build a paper mache black hole. But when it comes to fantasy, creatures, monsters, people getting hurt, and scenes of physical peril, CGI often ages very quickly. Instead, movies like The Lord of the Rings rely heavily on practical effects. So when you watch those battles 25 years later, the orcs still look exactly the same. The miniature cities still look exactly the same. It costs more, it takes more time, and it actually requires CGI as humans, but in the long run, people will keep on enjoying it. And in the short term, it's more pleasing to the human eye. You can cover CGI as much as possible, but the human eye is very well trained to spot it, and it just doesn't feel natural. Now, some CGI was obviously still used in the Odyssey. It would have been impossible to create some scenes otherwise, but where possible, they went practical. For example, the whole Cyclops scene was created with a giant animatronic puppet. Imagine if that had been entirely CGI. In a few years, we would be looking back at this and saying, that's some Scorpion King stuff. I'm really looking forward to some more behind the scenes footage on how they actually made these sequences, but we are starting to get some behind the scenes images with miniatures, forced perspective, giant puppets, animatronics. Nolan said that he actually considered having actors playing gods and physically throwing thunderbolts down the side of Mount Olympus. And for how crazy that sounds, I would genuinely like to see how he planned to pull that off. I was absolutely drawn into this film. There were some absolutely nerve-wracking, nearly horror sequences. For example, Circe, I think that's the correct pronunciation. And now we're starting to tread into more spoilery information. Again, these are all stories that have been around for centuries and have been depicted in other instances. I mean, even Miyazaki introduced this concept in Spirited Away. But tread lightly from here on if you don't want any spoilers. Actually, this probably wouldn't even be a good video to watch in the first place if you don't want any spoilers at all. But anyway, as I was saying, one of the scariest sequences in the Odyssey is the one in which Odysseus' soldiers are transformed into pigs by the witch. And it's done entirely with clever editing and actual puppets. And it's absolutely disgusting in the best way possible, with them gorging themselves with this food before being molded by the witch into the pigs. I really don't understand the criticism for Samantha Morton's performance here. We'll get to the cast in a little bit, but people have been complaining about her backstory being glossed over, about her losing her patience for no reason, about her punishing the soldiers when they actually hadn't done anything to her. Now, anybody who has studied Homer more than me can definitely comment letting us know how faithful her character is to the source material. But within the context of the film, it is implied that although these soldiers haven't hurt her, it is implied that others have. And a great portion of the movie deals with this concept of trauma, guilt, moral ambiguity. But let's close the special effects first. Fun fact, the people behind the special effects for the Odyssey are the same people behind the Lord of the Rings. The people who made like 80-90 million individual links of chainmail for hundreds of actors. So it's honestly a pity when a good 6 months before the movie has even released, people already started spewing hatred towards a production that in reality clearly has some effort put into it, while also having the insanely high expectations which can never be met because the bar just keeps getting pushed higher and higher. Especially when 99% of what we're fed nowadays is absolute slop, written with AI, lazily produced, with the sole intention of being dumped straight onto streaming in industrial quantities with very little care for the fact that cinema is technically the seventh art. But I digress again. Back to the special effects. They also did a lot of on-set shooting. People were actually in boats, they were filming inside caves, on hillsides, in castles, and it really shows. When ships were breaking apart, I genuinely believe that was wood splitting. During the storm scenes, everything became so messy and confusing that we could barely tell the characters apart. It was just waves and spit and scream and wind, but that's probably what it would have actually felt like. People looked disgusting, soaked, wet, exhausted, and Nolan even had Matt Damon grow out his actual beard for a whole year because he said it would look more realistic, especially on an IMAX camera. Now, you've probably heard this word IMAX thrown around quite a lot. It's one of, if not the best quality format you can shoot on. And I went back to get ye old scriptures. There is a sentence that I would like to share with you. This is a collection of essays about Nolan. It gets quite technical in some points. It's well over a decade old. I don't even know. I think Interstellar might have just been released or had to be released when this came out. But basically back then, Nolan had just only started experimenting with IMAX. He had done some shots for The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises. If I'm not mistaken, the very first shot we ever see of his in IMAX is the Joker leaning out of the window in The Dark Knight, but don't take that as factual information. I would need to fact check myself on that. But since then, he's basically been pushing it further and further until now achieving the Odyssey entirely in IMAX. And there's this one quote in the book that's always stuck with me. So it's talking about the difficulty in concealing the tricks of filmmaking. IMAX will not allow polyester to pass for silk. And ever since reading that sentence back in the day, I just couldn't wait to watch an IMAX movie. So understand how excited I was for this film. The downside to IMAX cameras is that they're very big, and for this movie they made them even bulkier by encasing them to reduce the amount of noise they produce. So when you see those incredible shots from inside the boats or the horse, just remember that they actually got that enormous camera into there. They really did everything they possibly could to get this shot. And I don't know whether this was amplified by the IMAX experience, but I at some points was nearly feeling nauseous while riding those waves, and I loved it. Now, am I allowed to say that you don't really need to watch this film in IMAX, and that a good part of the hype is marketing to get you to spend more money and go to watch this film in IMAX? No, you can't say that, otherwise you're not a Nolan fan. Just joking. I mean, I've been curious for years to experience an IMAX cinema. The first person who I know who told me about it was a friend who had been in London. I never got around to it because, simply put, here in Italy, there aren't that many IMAX cinemas. When this film was announced, my boyfriend and I, our friends, decided to make a proper field trip out of it. And the experience really was fantastic. Like I said, I felt completely immersed in the movie. I was practically shaking in my seat. And yes, remind me to get back to sound and soundtrack later. And also because of how the cinema is designed, you never have your view obstructed, but the tickets are very expensive. It took out a big chunk of a whole day, paying the motorway, driving all the way there. It's more of a special treat that you plan months in advance. So please don't feel let out if you hear about all these connoisseurs going on about how you're missing out if you're not watching it in IMAX and preaching about only seeing it in 70 millimeters. The pressure, the marketing done about this IMAX experience has been so big that people are actually paying to sit in the front rows of an IMAX cinema, which completely defeats the whole purpose. At that point, just watching a normal cinema and you'll get a better viewing experience. I'm sure that if IMAX had not been an option, I would have enjoyed the film anywhere at my local cinema. And guess what? I'm going back to my normal cinema to watch all the next movies. Although maybe there have been talks amongst us of possibly Godzilla Minus Zero, but we'll reevaluate that further on. Now, we're always in good hands with cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema, with whom Nolan has collaborated ever since Interstellar. I'm also a huge fan of his previous collaborator, Wally Pfister, but I can see how Pfister really excelled in more urban settings. To be fair, I'll always be curious about how Pfister would have shot Tenet. Now, I mention these names because Nolan tends to work with a recurring crew, a very close-knit, repetitive team. He only did one major overhaul around Tenet when he changed a lot of collaborators, but for years he's been collaborating with editor Jennifer Lame, with cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema, for the music Ludwig Göransson, and many other recurring crew members. And along with the crew members, Nolan also has a very repetitive cast, and this was my biggest issue with the film when the cast was announced. In my opinion, you can't have an epic, sweeping, mythical, ancient Greek story, try to make it as immersive and realistic as possible, and then cast the most famous, recognizable actors you can find. And we're not just talking about some famous names in the cast, we're talking about dozens and dozens of A-listers. So I'm supposed to immerse myself in this world of gods and monsters and heroes while looking at Tom Holland, who this week is starring in the massive new Spider-Man movie, Anne Hathaway, who until a few months ago was plastered everywhere promoting the new Devil Wears Prada movie. I love Himesh Patel, but throughout the movie I couldn't stop thinking that Nolan cast him because they'd already worked together on Tenet. And on top of that, some of these actors have very modern Hollywood faces. Thankfully, not everybody. Nolan is still a person who casts people with average normal faces, but I just couldn't get past, for example, Charlize Theron's perfectly plucked eyebrows, brows and modern faces, making her whole Calypso scene look like a perfume advert. I've seen fans defended Anne Hathaway for having one wrinkle, emotion line in her most intense scene throughout the whole movie. And unfortunately with Nolan, there's no going back from this. He just keeps collecting more and more actors. I'm not saying you shouldn't cast famous actors whatsoever. I mean, Matt Damon's Odysseus turned out to be even way better than I expected, but it's the sheer amount of insanely famous A-lister faces that just drags you completely out of the experience. This personally annoyed me even more than the woke casting choices, because I'm not annoyed specifically about Lupita Nyong'o's casting as Helen of Troy, or the inclusion of Elliot Page as a trans person in the cast, because technically everybody here is miscast. I don't think anybody of the main actors of Greek or even vaguely Mediterranean ethnicity, maybe Benny Safdie, who plays Agamemnon, has some ancestry here. And ironically, Agamemnon ended up being one of the coolest characters in the movie, despite having very few lines and us barely even seeing his face, which proves you don't always need Hollywood's biggest names. This has obviously been a very sensitive topic in Greece, and I get it. I mean, it's as if here in Italy we were suddenly fed a movie, a Hollywood movie about ancient Rome with totally American or British actors, and I don't know, Tom Hardy playing Julius Caesar. I can understand why some criticism would have been brought up. I've talked extensively in the past about Nolan's casting choices because sometimes they really are bizarre. Sometimes they turn out brilliantly. Heath Ledger was heavily criticized when he was cast as a Joker in The Dark Knight, and now people complain whenever anybody else plays the roles. But we then had Nolan saying Harry Styles simply auditioned like everybody else for Dunkirk and got the part. Let's be honest, those were exactly the years where there was an attempt to launch Harry Styles as an actor, and he was at the peak of his popularity from a marketing perspective. One of you actually left a very interesting comment under my other Odyssey video saying how Nolan nearly treats his cast as a theatre troupe, basically assigning the same actors different roles depending on what the story, what comes up in the story, even if it's just a voice role. And the more I think of it, the more I think it's a perfect way to describe his approach. So no, I don't think Nolan cast Elliot Page because he needed the LGBT quota. We're talking about a director who, until just a couple of movies ago, barely wrote women into his films. And when he did, they often weren't even portrayed particularly positively. I think he cast Elliot Page because they'd already worked together on Inception. Nolan himself admits that some of his casting choices are peculiar, in particular Lupita Nyong'o's, and he is open to discussion. I generally think we need to have some positive criticism about films without descending into the most racist AI edits before even watching the movie. Unfortunately, a lot of people took this film and used it to wage their own culture wars, often without even watching the film or without even understanding who plays whom. There are still people who genuinely think Elliot Page is playing Achilles. One comment I read online actually brings up instead a very interesting point. Because obviously nobody on earth could possibly agree on who the most beautiful woman is, something which Helen of Troy represents, maybe the important thing is that she stands out because she's striking. In my previous video, I used the White Witch from Narnia as an example, and whether or not you personally think Lupita Nyong'o is the most beautiful woman in the world, she undeniably has striking features that immediately make her stand out among the rest of the cast. In that same video, I also went through the actual Oscar eligibility and inclusion rules because yes, I'm petty when it comes to these kinds of things, and also because back in the days when this was announced, I was very afraid that people would stop making good movies for the sake of making good movies and start to work around these rules first. But once you actually read the rules, you realize that having minorities in your cast is only one of the many different ways for a movie to qualify. Most of the criteria actually involve the crew. And have you ever seen a Nolan-sized production? Trust me, Lupita Nyong'o and Elliot Page are not the make or break it factor when it comes to Nolan's potential future Oscars. And honestly, for the AI editors out there who haven't even seen the movie yet, do you realize that you're arguing over maybe a total of 2 minutes of screen time? You're basically treating this film as if the poster is Elliot Page waving the LGBT flag. So once I decided to settle that aside, as this is the cast we're working with, I decided to check out whether the acting was good or not. Overall, I liked the cast. some more, some less. Again, those who have studied Homer will be able to let us know better whether their dialogues, whether their interpretations are faithful to the source material. The one character I'm very curious about is Robert Pattinson's. Is he actually supposed to be this sleazy, annoying, and nearly comedically annoying character? One of my favorite characters was Agamemnon. I loved the way he just imposes himself on the whole room. I loved every time he appeared on screen, the look of his armor, although I know it was criticized by historians, and what the kids would call the Batman aura farming aesthetic. Don't ever let those words ever come out of my mouth again. I surprisingly liked Matt Damon, but as always, I fell in love with the side characters. I think we can all agree that one of the best performances was John Leguizamo's Odysseus' faithful servant, with one of the most emotional portrayals of the whole cast, and I have a strong feeling he will receive an Oscar nomination. Now I'm going to start adding some bigger spoilers, but I assume that if you're still watching, that's okay. As in many other Nolan movies, most of these characters are morally conflicted. In all of Nolan's movies, we've never had a lead role with no regrets and a totally reliable narrator. Forget all that with Nolan, and it returns here in the Odyssey. For a great deal of the movie, we are told to be fearful of these men from the sea who have been said to have destroyed cities around the Mediterranean, attacked people, ruined their communities, and until Odysseus' mind starts showing us that that's exactly what his crew was doing. They were the ones attacking, destroying, demanding, killing, whether it was warranted or not. And big spoiler here, while his mind is unraveling with guilt about his soldiers dying for his fault, the damage his army has done, we realize that the woman he's been talking to in his mind all along is actually taking the form of a woman he saw killed under his command. Now, whether that was actually Athena, who he merges with the face of the woman he saw dying, or whether this is entirely a figment of his imagination, is left up to debate. Another part in which regret and guilt and moral ambiguity is heavily featured is when Odysseus and his crew visit the underworld and they meet the soldiers who didn't receive a proper burial, and more importantly, they meet Sinon, who was basically tricked into near certain death and left behind to gift the Trojan horse. This again is another one of Nolan's recurring themes, the noble lie. We've seen this happen in The Prestige, Interstellar, Inception. So at first the Odyssey might not seem like the blueprint Nolan movie, but he's worked across such vast genres and stories that I think we can spot him more in micro themes. Another one, for example, is the struggle of returning home to your family and that mix of bliss and pain in forgetting and remaining in a dreamlike state. We can easily see that Odysseus eating Calypso's lotus flower is very similar to struggling to remember and escape the dream world in Inception. Even the editing, although done by a different person compared to Nolan's early work, still has some typical Nolan features. For example, the nearly fraction of a second flashbacks when remembering his family, or even certain scene compositions such as the child only being shown from behind in memories. We then have the use of totem objects to identify a character, such as Penelope's brooch statue, which is a little like the Inception totems, the non-linear storytelling. The character stuck suffering in silence inside the horse was very reminiscent of the soldier stuck inside the boat in Dunkirk. And for all the Homer connoisseurs, would it be realistic for these soldiers to be able to build this perfectly constructive, polished, wonderful horse shape, so shiny and perfectly built? Does it make sense? Is it literally accurate, or is it just for movie aesthetics? It's been bugging me for a while. Now, all of this epic story comes to its conclusion in a nearly John Wick style sequence, which many have criticized as the weakest of the whole film, and I guess I can agree. Odysseus finally makes it home. We have the very touching scene of him meeting his dog who recognizes him. I was looking forward to that moment. But then we have a very bland and predictable, nearly superhero reveal between father and son, and then things quickly lead into a very lengthy fight sequence. And here I understand that Odysseus is very strong, but he's also older and weak, and he's fighting against much younger men, and yet they all seem to suffer from this stormtrooper disease, and a whole room can't overpower him. So again, Homer connoisseurs, is he getting some supernatural help from the gods? Because we are told by hearing the rumbling of the sky that the gods are interested in this situation. But there is one highlight of this sequence, which is when Odysseus strings his bow with the very famous twang, which you can hear in the soundtrack. I felt that twang in my core. I felt sounds in this movie that I don't even know how to explain. I don't know whether it was rumbling of the storms sounds, whether it was music, whether it was people screaming, the Cyclops, it was just so overpowering, beautiful. And that twang that we'd already heard at the beginning of the film is one of the very small details that the movie makes sure that you remember, even within 3 hours of non-stop information. Another example is Odysseus's foot injury, which the movie makes sure that you remember after 3 hours of family trees, explanations of decades-long war and the lore of the gods, yet it makes sure we remembered it very clear without over-exposition. I now need to listen to Ludwig Göransson's score more carefully. Up until now, I'm loving it. At the moment, I'm liking it more than Oppenheimer's score, which honestly didn't really make me feel that much. I much prefer Göransson's music in Tenet, although in some sections I've often said it is still a bit Hans Zimmery, somebody Nolan used to collaborate for years. So all in all, I think this was an excellently well done film with flaws, as all movies have, but which are heavily outweighed by the rest of the craft. I don't feel like I can complain too much while we're still getting overall an excellent work. I'm 100% sure this will definitely cash in big during awards season, especially with the technical categories, which have always been Nolan's forte. He is up against big contenders this year with Dune 3, and I'm sure Project Hail Mary will squeeze in there with the technical categories. Now, Nolan's productions have always been big, but they seem to become bigger and bigger. The bar is always higher. What on earth will he do next? And at what point does it become too much and just a show of who can pay the most for the best cast and the best cameras? I mean, Nolan made some great movies with much smaller means like The Prestige and Insomnia, and to be honest, for how much I'm entertained, sometimes I would like him to go back to that and show us actually him and not what money can buy. He has hinted at being interested in directing a horror movie, which I think would be very interesting. Maybe he could sprinkle in a little of his non-linear storytelling and more urban setting. I don't know how that would turn out to be. What I do know with Nolan is that this will all be in 3 years' time. Every time I do a Nolan review, I end up saying how we're going to have to wait for another 3 years. And I also know that whatever he decides to do, people will start hating and criticizing it, whatever he does. There's never a correct way to do it. I'm personally just happy to go to the movies. That's my life. And if you've stuck all the way to this point, thank you so much for the support. And I would now love to hear what you think about the Odyssey. So please leave a comment down below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.